So my guest is Rory Finnin. He is a professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge. Hello and welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
In the Western world, Ukraine was something close to Russia. People said that even our president, one of our presidents in past, Leonid Kuchma, he wrote the book, Ukraine is not Russia. In your opinion, what is the global difference between Ukraine and Russia?
Wow. A huge question, because there are so many differences. First of all, I think for an international audience, it's important to recognize that before the 17th century in particular, the peoples that we now call Ukrainians and Russians, they lived in completely different orbits altogether. So most Ukrainians were residents on the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Their connections with Muscovy, which later becomes the Russian Empire, were few and very rare. The one thing that joined them was the Orthodox faith. But it's very important for the world to recognize massive cultural and civilizational differences between Ukrainians and Russians. Even in the 17th century, when the Ukrainian Cossacks aligned themselves with Muscovy, at the so-called Treaty of Pereyaslav, translators were needed between the Cossacks and the representatives of the Tsar from Moscow. So there were major linguistic, cultural differences. Over the centuries since, the main cultural and social narrative that has been key to the Ukrainian national movement has been defiant freedom, or volia. Mm-hmm. And it's most powerfully articulated in the poetry of Taras Shevchenko in the 19th century. This is poetry not only about the liberation of the Ukrainian people, it's liberation of all peoples who suffer under colonial domination. So when Shevchenko is writing about the corrupt and oppressive rule of the Tsar, he's not only talking about Ukraine, he talks about the Caucasus. He talks about places like Circassia, which is a vibrant polity in the 19th century that many readers in the West knew about. They knew that the Russian forces were killing the Circassian people and causing this massive displacement of Circassians across the Black Sea to Turkey. These places we've since forgotten, and we've forgotten about them mainly in a lot of academic circles. So the major differences between Ukrainians and Russians comes down to this message in their national cultures. On the one hand, Ukrainians focus on volia, this notion of freedom, and a suspicion of strongmen, mm-hmm. of hierarchies of statehood, hierarchies of power. For the Ukrainian national movement, there were problems with aristocracy to the west in Poland and autocracy to the east in Muscovy and later the Russian Empire. In Russia, the major story in their history is velich, greatness, mm-hmm. the greatness of the state. So Ukrainians are driven over centuries by an idea of liberation that is about social justice, lifting up the poor. In Russia, there's a great focus on centers of power, their own culture, and a domination of other smaller nations around them.
Mm-hmm. You know a lot about Ukraine, you studied, but speaking about usual, ordinary people in USA, in Europe, for example, I think that now everyone understands the difference during this full-scale invasion of Russia. But before this full-scale invasion, we had war during 10 years. Before this full-scale invasion, did people abroad understand this difference?
No, not on a popular level, not as well as they should have. This is a centuries-long campaign of Russian soft power in the West, and it's a very complicated story. The main thing is that it has focused our Western attention on places like Moscow and Petersburg. Mm-hmm. But we don't focus enough on places like Tbilisi, Minsk, Kyiv, Donetsk, and then even farther in the Russian Federation itself in places like, Irkutsk, Vladivostok, etc. So there's been a very simplistic and often reductive study of Russia and of Russian culture. But that has been the study that's been pushed out into the Western world. It's been funded by different sources, particularly by the Russian state. Ukraine, in particular, hasn't been able to compete on this level in terms of the world's attention. So we at Cambridge, since 2008, have been teaching Ukrainian culture and literature and history on its own terms. So our students study Ukraine not from some Russian-centric view, but they study Ukraine on its own terms. And I think that's an important thing that universities around the world need to do better because, as you said, this is a 10-year war already, a decade of great suffering that could have been prevented or at least mitigated a bit if we knew Ukraine better. And I think Putin has always used our ignorance of Ukraine against us in this respect. It has fed his aggression.
You know, Russian propaganda, from time to time, we talk with our guests that European countries, USA, they all try to fight against Russian propaganda, but Kremlin's narratives, they nevertheless, they go inside this country or that country. And speaking about this, we are Ukrainian Russians are brothers or something like that. No, maybe we're brothers more with Americans, for example, than with Russians. And speaking about Putin, for someone he is a monster, for someone he is a cancer. How can you describe this person, this dictator, this killer?
I almost don't want to give him any of my words and any of my thoughts. He's all the things you mentioned. I do think that in the West we pay close attention to Putin when we should be studying much more closely Russian society, because I think if we did that, we would see problems of chauvinistic nationalism in Russia that have led to most Russians supporting Putin in this neo-imperialist war. I think we have not focused enough on the diversity, the complexities of these different societies. Instead, we focus on corridors of power in the Kremlin. I think going back to this question of propaganda, you mentioned the so-called brotherhood. This is the kind of idea that many Russians like to bring up, the whole Druzhba Narodiv, the friendship of peoples trope or idea in the Soviet period. And this always has Russia as the first among all of these other nations. And it is something that is completely irrelevant to the histories of independent nations. So in the United States, we don't say that we are brothers with Canadians, even though we have a lot of history with them, for sure. But when we use that term, we often are putting that brother in a particular position, right? The younger brother, the secondary brother. And that is the trick of Russian propaganda. And unfortunately, because we've had a lot of Western scholars who've not paid attention to Ukraine, they naturally assume this brotherhood trope. And they use terms like Little Russia, for instance, to imply that somehow Ukraine has had a secondary place when historically it's been, in many respects, primary. So this is something we need to push back and fight against. We've been doing this now at Cambridge for over 15 years. And now I think, and I'm pleased to see that there's progress around the world in focusing on Ukraine and understanding its essential differences. Yes, there are similarities with Poles, Belarusians, Turks, Tatars, Russians. These connections exist and we should celebrate them too, but they do not mean that there is some sort of dependent relationship that Ukrainians have to Russians or that there's a special relationship between Ukrainians and Russians. One of the stories that we need to focus on is the history of Russian colonialism. So many of my colleagues in the West will say, well, you know, Ukrainians have many Russian family members, and that's completely true. But we also have to acknowledge that a lot of this came from Russian settler colonialism when they would, for instance, in the 18th century, conquer the Crimean Tatar Khanate, displace the Crimean Tatars, and then settle Russians and other Slavs in their place, which means that demographically everything changed, and often changed to support Russian power. This is going on right now, as we all know, horribly in occupied parts of Ukraine, where Russian settlers are coming in, taking homes. And these relationships are often coming at the cost of a lot of blood throughout history. Our job as scholars and academics is to confront this knowledge and to try to spread it so it doesn't, to try to spread the knowledge that the violence and the bloodshed doesn't continue.
And taking into consideration your experience, what are the main ways of fighting against propaganda? Studying, but not all the people want to just read, just study this information, get it somewhere. How to fight?
we have to think of this as a war with many fronts.
Absolutely.
So there's, of course, the front of fact-checking. We have to, of course, with every lie, say the truth. But there's an expression in the American tradition from Mark Twain that a lie travels all the way around the world before the truth can get its trousers on. Mm-hmm. Fact-checking only takes us so far. So you mentioned study and scholarship, the most important thing, and that has to be not only at the level of universities, but at the level of schools. So when children are learning from a young age about the history of empire, that they study not only the French Empire, the Portuguese or British empires, these empires on oceans, maritime empires, but they also study land empires like Russia and understand how they have operated over many centuries. That's a major initiative. But the other thing is to be creative and to use artists, filmmakers, musicians to equip us creatively in our minds to confront problems of disinformation and propaganda. One of my students has created a game online, actually, where you play the role of being someone interested in disinforming people. But by playing the game, he's been able to show that people are more attuned and more aware of how disinformation works. So there are a lot of creative methods that we need to employ, but we need to think about this as a multi-fronted war.
How do you think do United States of America are afraid of Russia, of Putin? Because we don't know whether Russia will go, because now Ukraine is really shield of Europe, and we don't know what is Putin going on to do next. What about US? Because I understand that maybe Putin and Russia will be afraid to fight against USA, but nevertheless, it can influence on the global position, on the global area, and then it will influence also US.
There are many issues in the United States right now that are not helping Ukraine. The most important thing for Americans to understand about Ukraine is that it's very similar to the United States in this belief in liberty and freedom. Americans do truly grow up with this respect for the idea of liberty. Ukrainians have been fighting for their liberty for centuries. They've been fighting for it for 10 years. In this period after the fall of the Soviet Union, we should see ourselves in the image of Ukrainians. And we've also made promises to them. We made promises to them time and time again. One of them is, of course, the promises in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where we committed to supporting Ukraine if Ukraine was ever a victim of aggression. So we've made promises, we've made obligations, and we also should see commonalities with Ukrainians politically and socially. Unfortunately, there has been, particularly driven by the presidency of Donald Trump, an attempt to wage a war about domestic U.S. issues and bring Ukraine into the mix. And that's a dangerous thing for our security. I would say at the moment, that problem of Republican inaction and obstruction is also complemented by a lack of vision with respect to some of our colleagues in the Biden administration, who seem to think about an engagement with Russia as a constant calculation between costs and benefits. That if we maybe put forward a number of other sanctions, that eventually the Russians will see the light and change their mind. That's not happening, and that won't happen. And so we need to be bolder, we need to be more creative. Above all, we need to give Ukraine the weapons that they've asked for over 2 years, and even so, during the Obama administration, for probably close to 8 or so. That is, javelins were requested by the Ukrainian military forces back after 2014, and they were not given. So this focus on being bold has to be something that Western politicians embrace, and I hope they will.
You know, I'll ask you as a professor and just a human, how do you think when the Russian-Ukrainian war will end and what should happen for this?
I think about this a lot, and I think, like all my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, I imagine it very often. For me, as someone who studies this region of the world, it's very clear that the only way peace comes back to Europe is by way of Ukraine's absolute victory. That is a restoration of the 1991 borders of Ukraine, a liberated Donbass and a liberated Crimea. This is not, on my part, wishful thinking. It's a reality that any kind of land for peace deal will never work. The Russians have been very clear about the need for them to conquer Ukraine. Their aggression will not stop, just as it didn't stop after 2014, 2016, 2017, and on and on. So that's something we need to recognize, that only when Ukraine has its borders restored will there be a defense of the global order, this notion of the sovereignty of nations, the inviolability of borders. That needs to be protected. We need to defend that, and we need to be bolder and confident in our defense and our support of Ukraine in this regard. I think it's very feasible, this victory. I think right now in the West there is an embrace of narratives that aren't necessarily always reflecting reality. So there's some pessimism that is ignoring, for instance, the successes of the Ukrainian military in the Black Sea and with respect to Crimea, and a focus on problems at the front in Donbass. That lack of attention on one area of this war and this hyper-focus on another is not helping our morale, and it's not helping our vision for the future. So I think we need to be more open to the variety of ways in which this war is being waged by Ukraine and in many respects being won by Ukraine. That's a positive story that those in the West have to support and defend. If we do that, if we follow through on our own principles, if we give Ukrainians that which they ask for, I am very convinced that Ukrainian victory is on the horizon. It just takes our will, as well as our imagination and our solidarity with each other to make it happen.
At the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask you, can you explain to our viewers, we have viewers in USA, in Japan, in Great Britain, in different countries of Europe, why they need victory of Ukraine?
Sometimes it's difficult to see history and to see future in terms of centuries. We tend to think of them in terms of weeks, if not days. We're living at a very pivotal time because in the past, the international legal order that was established after the Second World War was not perfect. But it managed to bring peace to a Europe that saw genocide after genocide and great struggle and violence. What Russia is doing now is trying to destroy this order completely, not simply with respect to Ukraine, but around the world. And we're starting to see how other authoritarian nations are following Russia's example, aiding Russia's military attempts to conquer Ukraine. This is a threat to everyone's security around the world because our children and our grandchildren, if we don't stand up now and support Ukraine, will be fighting wars with various authoritarian regimes that think it's okay to conquer and cross borders and invade other nations simply because they can. This is a kind of, 9th century mentality that we need to stop soon and not wait for it to get worse. And I think there's a bit of a so-called wishful thinking bias that, it can't get that bad, it can't get worse than this. It very much can. Democracy is fragile. We need to defend it every day. And Ukraine is right now the shield of not only Europe, but also this international legal order and the very shield of this notion of freedom and volia that we talked about before. Supporting Ukraine is a way of protecting that. If we just accept a new normal, call upon Ukraine to make negotiations that will never bring peace and will also be offensive to those Ukrainians who live in occupied territory, who are objects of oppression and torture. We can't abandon people like this. We can't ignore and turn our eyes away from it. So that's why it's so critical that all of us, no matter where we're from, if we believe in the idea, the promise of an international legal order, if we accept that people should be able to speak their own language and elect their own political leaders, and if we demand that we all interact with each other in peace and not with military aggression, then supporting Ukraine is the least we can do, and it's something we need to do urgently.
Thank you for these words, and thank you for support and for the interview.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'll remind to our viewers it was Rory Finnin, Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge.